The interest of dimethyltryptamine, or DMT for short, has skyrocketed over the past few years. For decades, people viewed the consumption of DMT and psychedelic drugs in a negative light. But because of proponents of the drug such as Graham Hancock, Rick Strassman, and of course Joe Rogan, the stigma behind DMT is beginning to fade away. Some people have claimed that the use of DMT has changed their outlook on the world and reality itself. Many claim that their minds are transported to a different dimension that seems more real than the material world in which we currently live. One of the most common experiences that people claim to have during DMT trips are encounters with entities that seem to be communicating with people, often in some nonverbal form. It's obvious that these kinds of stories and reports have caused a massive increase in DMT consumption over the past few years. We know that many psychedelics containing DMT, such as ayahuasca, were used by shamans in ancient civilizations for religious and healing purposes. Despite this, it is still a mystery as to how many of these civilizations were able to discover the effects of DMT and other psychedelics on the human mind. But what if I told you that the ancient Book of Enoch actually mentions the use of this drug, as well as the way it was discovered by humans of the past? In this video, I want to take a look at DMT and how it could potentially tie into the Book of Enoch. But before we get into that, I want to take a look at the experiences that people claim to have while consuming this mysterious drug known as DMT. We know that DMT is a naturally occurring substance that is present in animals, various plants, and humans. Recent studies show that DMT has been found to be present in the brains of rats and very possibly the brains of humans as well. The drug was used by ancient shamans near southwestern Bolivia for various religious and healing purposes. In terms of the drug's recent history, DMT was first synthesized by chemist Richard Monska in 1931. The substance's psychedelic properties, however, remained unknown for years. The psychedelic properties were not properly understood until 1956 by Hungarian chemist Stephen Zara. Stephen Zara is credited with being the first person to scientifically evaluate the effects of DMT on humans. This is because he administered synthetic DMT to 20 volunteers and studied the effects. This is where the modern study of the effects of DMT on humans began. Many, if not most DMT users claim that the drug allows their mind to roam into some type of reality or dimension that is separate from the material world in which we currently live. Some ancient civilizations believed that these drugs were sacred and able to be used to contact the spiritual realm and higher planes of existence that our minds typically don't have access to. Although this idea was looked down upon in the recent past, many people are beginning to come to the same conclusion as these ancient civilizations. Rick Strassman, a well-known psychedelic researcher, has spent years studying the effects of DMT on the mind. In his documentary DMT: The Spirit Molecule, he documents many of his subjects' experiences on DMT trips. One person claims that the experiences they had while on DMT changed their entire outlook on the world and view of the afterlife.
It was all very, very impersonal until I got to the space where I realized that I was in the area where souls await rebirth. And I was there, and I had been there so many times before. I recognized it, and this incredible transcendent peace came over me. I have never in my life felt such peace. Everything was stripped away. Every hope, every fear, every attachment to the material world was completely stripped out of me. I was free to just be the essence of a soul.
Strassman also claims that the pineal gland, a small endocrine gland that is located in the center of the brain, releases large amounts of DMT upon birth and death. Some have claimed that ancient Egyptians were somehow aware of the pineal gland's function, and that the Eye of Horus is actually modeled after the physical pineal gland. If DMT was actually released by our brains upon death, it could explain why some claim that DMT trips allow for users to interact with some type of spiritual realm or higher plane of existence beyond that of the material world. One study conducted in 2018 sought to find some overlap between near-death experiences, or NDEs, to the experiences that are induced by DMT. The study used a scale known as the NDE scale to determine how much DMT actually induced near-death type experiences. Many participants of the study who took DMT reported seeing bright lights, feelings of joy, encountering entities, and having out-of-body experiences, all of which correlated to that of near-death experiences. The study concluded that DMT does in fact have much overlap to near-death experiences, and that psychedelics could potentially be used to model the neurobiology of dying. Jordan Peterson recently interviewed Dennis McKenna about the world of psychedelic drug use. Dennis McKenna is the brother of Terence McKenna, who was a major proponent of the use of psychedelic drugs during the 1980s. Dennis McKenna is also another major researcher of psychedelic drugs. He mentions in the interview that he spent much of his time studying ayahuasca during his PhD research at the University of British Columbia.
Now, you spent some time studying ayahuasca.
Yes, so I did. My PhD research at the University of British Columbia was basically about ayahuasca, about looking at the chemistry, pharmacology, botanical sources, traditional uses of ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca is a psychoactive and entheogenic brewed drug that originated in South America. Ayahuasca has been used by shamans of indigenous people near the Amazon basin for both ceremonial and medicinal purposes. The major psychoactive ingredient in ayahuasca is DMT. Ayahuasca is essentially DMT combined with other compounds that allows for the DMT to be activated through the gut. This allows users of ayahuasca to have longer lasting experiences relative to those who only smoke DMT. Graham Hancock mentioned on the Joe Rogan podcast that there are researchers at the Imperial College in London who are using the timed release of ayahuasca in order to map out the supposed DMT realm.
DMT is a very short-acting experience when you smoke it. It's about 12 minutes, maybe less. You're in there, you're plunged into a completely convincing, sometimes terrifying, parallel reality. It's so confusing, you hardly know what's going on, and then you're out again. But you come out with a feeling that something's been downloaded to you. In Imperial College, they found a way to keep people in the peak state of DMT for an hour. So they have time to find their way around the DMT realm that they find themselves in. And the astonishing thing is that these volunteers, both men and women, are all coming back with accounts of meeting the same entities and the same world. And it has to raise the question that what happens with DMT is that it alters the receiver wavelength of the brain, and that it allows us to gain access to other realities, that these encounters are not unreal, that they're real, but they're real on a level that we can't experience in a day-to-day state of consciousness. Ultimately, the aim of this project is to map the DMT realm.
Graham Hancock explains in the interview that many people who have had these experiences tend to interact with some form of entities that reside in the DMT realm. These entities have been described by people in a variety of different ways. What's interesting is that there is often overlap of the general appearances and attributes of these entities among different users. The most common entity that is encountered among DMT users are referred to as machine elves, a term coined by Terence McKenna. Terence coined the term machine elves in order to be able to describe the entities he encountered during his experiences with psychedelics. Machine elves are often described as self-transforming machine creatures. Terence recalls his first encounters with these entities in his book, True Hallucinations. Terence writes, "During my own experiences smoking synthesized DMT in Berkeley, I had the impression of bursting into a space inhabited by merry elfin self-transforming machine creatures. Dozens of these friendly fractal entities, looking like self-dribbling Fabergés on the rebound, had surrounded me and tried to teach me the lost language of true poetry. These various creatures are often able to communicate with DMT users through a nonverbal form." Terence McKenna attempted to describe their language in his book. Terence writes, "It is a language but not made of words, a language which becomes and which is the things it describes. It is a more perfect archetypal logos." Dennis McKenna also claimed during his interview with Jordan Peterson that Terence would have long conversations with these entities in dark rooms rather frequently.
You know, and my brother, he would take high doses of mushrooms, by himself and in total darkness. That was his formula. And he would have these dialogues, these conversations with these entities. And it was all about, how do I know you're real? Can you tell me something that I cannot possibly know? And if you do that, I'll know you're real. And they would say, well, we don't care if you think we're real or not,
This is confirmed by Terence McKenna himself. Terence would often describe the creatures as being friendly and having some type of conversations with them. Terence wrote, "You burst into this space and they're saying, 'How wonderful that you're here. You come so rarely. We're so delighted to see you.'" Many others have had similar experiences to that of Terence McKenna. In Rick Strassman's documentary, many reported interacting with various entities or machine elves while on DMT. One user described some of the entities as being similar to that of angelic beings.
And there were these winged beings. I don't remember exactly what they looked, but were like angels, something like angels, that were majestically kind of flying through the space. But there was something about the quality of how they were flying that was unique. I'd never seen anything like it. It was like, I don't know, the sense of another realm that was there. My sense was at some point there was this implicit sense, this is the divine realm. This is the divine realm. And it was not like a thought, but it was like this implicit kind of grokking recognition.
Jennifer A. Like did some research regarding the experiences that people have with various entities. She analyzed 149 DMT trip reports from Arrowhead.org. Her goal was to emphasize the fact that not everyone interacts with machine elves, but sometimes report encountering a variety of different creatures. Some of these other creatures include formless beings, humanoid beings, divine beings, aliens, elves and fairies, animals, geometric objects, voices, faces, and a poorly defined category. She reports that the majority of the creatures described fit into the poorly defined category.
The largest category were entities that were fundamentally poorly defined or unclear. And so that obviously could be for two reasons. Either the person's experience of the entity was not yet clearly defined, or they just didn't report it very clearly in their trip report. So there's two possible reasons why that might have occurred.
She also emphasizes the fact that contrary to the experiences of Terence McKenna, not all interactions are positive. Based on her research, there are actually more hostile experiences than warm and welcoming ones. But by far, the majority of interactions with entities involve the entities showing or teaching the users some type of wisdom or knowledge.
The most common one by far was entities showing, teaching, or guiding the users.
Jennifer A. Like ends her presentation by mentioning that there is some major overlap between DMT trips, near-death experiences, mediumship, other forms of drug use, and alien abduction experiences. In my first UFO video, where I talked about the aliens that some have claimed to come in contact with during close encounters, I mentioned how there is a major overlap between the UFO phenomenon and transcendental meditation methods. It's fascinating that Jennifer was able to come to a similar conclusion regarding the effects of DMT on the human mind relative to these other various phenomena. With all that said, there is no definitive answer as to whether or not these experiences actually do allow the user's mind to roam into some external alternative world. Now that we have established the types of experiences that people have while on DMT, let's get into how the Book of Enoch could be alluding to some form of DMT or psychedelic drug knowledge. In order to determine what the Book of Enoch might be saying about DMT or psychedelic drugs, we have to understand what the Book of Enoch is and what it is not. When people refer to the Book of Enoch, they are almost always referring to First Enoch. The Book of Enoch, or First Enoch, is typically categorized as a pseudepigrapha. A pseudepigrapha is a term that is used to describe early Jewish literature that was written sometime during the Second Temple period, that is not included in the Jewish or Christian canons. The title, the Book of Enoch, also alludes to the idea that the biblical character Enoch in the book of Genesis wrote the book, which we will talk about in a second. The Book of Enoch is composed of a few different sections that most scholars believe were originally independent works that were eventually brought together to make up what we now know as First Enoch. These works include the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Book of Heavenly Luminaries, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. There are a ton of videos online that try to present the Book of Enoch as being some type of secret or banned book of the Bible that was purposely removed from the canon in order to keep it hidden from the public. This is just simply not true, as there is no evidence for this. Although there were fragments of the book written in Aramaic that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are a variety of reasons to believe that First Enoch should not be considered canon. One reason for this is because most scholars don't believe that Enoch wrote the majority, if any, of First Enoch. As mentioned before, most scholars date the Book of Enoch to sometime around 200 BC, which would have been centuries after the Enoch of the Old Testament would have lived. Scholars come to this conclusion because various parts of the Book of Enoch take inspiration or draw directly from other Old Testament writings. Also, the Book of Enoch has never been considered to be sacred scripture by any early Jewish author. The Jewish Bible, or Tanakh, which is the Christian Old Testament, is composed of 3 sections, which are the Law, Prophets, and Writings. The Tanakh was most likely already established by the time the Book of Enoch was written, and there is no evidence that the Book of Enoch was ever a part of it or added to it. We come to this conclusion based on the words of Jesus in Luke 24:44, which says, "Then he said to them, 'These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled.'" We can also take a look at the writings of Josephus to get an understanding as to what books made up the Tanakh during this time period. Josephus was a historian who lived during the 1st century, and he is known for his writings about the history of the Jewish people. and against Apion, Josephus mentions a number of books that make up the Jewish Tanakh. The number of books Josephus lists matches with the traditional Tanakh, and therefore shows that the books of the Old Testament were firmly established at this point, and most likely did not include the Book of Enoch. So if the Book of Enoch is not part of the canon, and many parts of it were not even written by Enoch, why are we taking the time to look at its content? The reason that the book is significant is because Jude quotes directly from the writings of Enoch in Jude 14-15. Jude writes, "It was also about these that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness, that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him." This is a direct quote taken from 1 Enoch. Since Jude does draw some insight from the Book of Enoch, it is possible that some parts of the writings could be attributed to the literal Enoch. Although there is no way to prove this, it seems like that is what Jude is alluding to in his writings. It is possible that there are parts of the Book of Enoch that could give some very useful historical information to the reader and shed some light on what was occurring around the time of Noah prior to the flood. Therefore, we can conclude that although parts of the Book of Enoch could be useful for attaining a deeper understanding of other parts of the Bible, primarily Genesis 6, it doesn't mean that it belongs in the canon or that it even gets everything correct. At the very least, it allows us to understand what the Jewish rabbis thought or believed during the time that the Book of Enoch was composed. With that said, the portion of the Book of Enoch we are primarily interested in is the first section, the Book of the Watchers. The Book of the Watchers is significant as it gives a lot of background information that is left out of what is now one of the most famous chapters in the Bible, Genesis 6. Genesis 6, 1-4 reads, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The sons of God are considered by most to be fallen angels. They are referred to as the Watchers in the Book of Enoch. The book of Genesis mentions that during those days, the sons of God, or the Watchers, made a decision to take the daughters of men as wives and create some hybrid offspring that we now know as the Nephilim. Although there is some debate about the identity of the Nephilim, many have begun to come to the conclusion that they were in fact literal giants that walked the earth prior to the flood of Noah. The Book of Enoch gives a lot of new information regarding this time period and these few verses that we have from the book of Genesis. The Book of Enoch tells us that the fallen angels did not just simply lust for the daughters of men on the earth and flippantly decided to mate with them, but actually made a calculated decision and swore an oath to cohabit with the daughters of men and create a hybrid offspring. 1 Enoch 6, 1-4 reads, "When the sons of men had multiplied in those days, beautiful and comely daughters were born to them. And the Watchers, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget children for ourselves. And Shemi-Hazah, their chief, said to them, I fear that you will not want to do this deed, and I alone shall be guilty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and let us all bind one another with a curse, that none of us turn back from this counsel until we fulfill it and do this deed. After the Watchers swore an oath, 1 Enoch tells us that they descended onto Mount Hermon, and that is where they bound one another with a curse. Then they all swore together and bound one another with a curse. And they were all of them 200 who descended in the days of Jared onto the peak of Mount Hermon. And they called the mountain Hermon because they swore and bound one another with a curse on it. The next part of 1 Enoch is where things get really interesting, and we can finally begin to bring everything together. After the angels descended on Mount Hermon and began to take for themselves wives and procreate, the Book of Enoch mentions that they began to teach them some type of sorcery and secret arts. 1 Enoch 7:1 reads, These and all the others with them took for themselves wives from among them, such as they chose. And they began to go into them and to defile themselves through them, and to teach them sorcery and charms, and to reveal to them the cutting of roots and plants. The part that I want to focus on is the cutting of roots and plants. Other versions of 1 Enoch have translated that portion of the verse as the dividing of roots and trees. So the question is, what are the cutting of roots and plants, and why is it being put together with the teaching of sorcery and charms? This bothered me for a long time, as I could not find anyone who had the definitive answer as to what the dividing of roots and trees actually referred to. But it begins to make sense when you learn what word is often used for sorcery and enchantments throughout the Bible. In the New Testament, the Greek word pharmakia is used by Paul in Galatians 5:20. The words that are translated from the word pharmakia are witchcraft and sorcery. The same word, pharmakia, is also used in Revelation 18:23 when referring to the destruction of Babylon in the end times. Strong's defines the word pharmakia as the use of medicine, drugs, or spells. This word is where we get the terms pharmacy, pharmacists, and more in the English language. From the word pharmakia, we can see that the Bible seems to tie some type of drug use to both sorcery and enchantments. In light of this information, is it possible that the dividing of roots in plants or roots in trees spoken of in 1 Enoch could be alluding to some type of drug use? Just from this information alone, it's easy to speculate, but there is no way to be certain just based on the language used in 1 Enoch and the New Testament. We can determine a slightly more definitive answer, however, when we take a look at the process of how ayahuasca is brewed and the way that DMT is extracted. When looking at the way that ayahuasca is brewed, one of the most important parts is literally breaking apart or dividing the ayahuasca vines. It's fascinating that this method seems to parallel the dividing of roots and trees that were taught by the Watchers to the daughters of men in the Book of Enoch. The fact that many ancient shamans use these techniques to interact with the supposed spiritual realm makes this connection even more interesting. There is no definitive explanation as to how these shamans were able to discover the ayahuasca brew, whose primary psychoactive ingredient is DMT. Dennis McKenna touches on his theory regarding the origin of ayahuasca during his interview with Jordan Peterson.
How did these indigenous people figure out this combination? One plant containing beta-carbolines and another containing DMT. Out of the 80,000 or so species in the Amazon, how did they stumble on this one combination? These cultures were very experimentally oriented toward plants. They had shamanic traditions, but they were familiar with the effects of these different plants, and they thought, well, what happens if we mix them? And they did. They had a spectacular result.
Dennis is essentially proposing the idea that these ancient shamans somehow accidentally stumbled upon this mystical brew through the experimentation of mixing various ingredients. While it is possible that these shamans may have just happened to stumble upon this mysterious drug, perhaps the Book of Enoch provides a more satisfying answer to the origins of DMT and psychedelic drug use in the past. Perhaps the Watchers who mated with the daughters of men were aware of the knowledge that could be attained through the use of these drugs and decided to entrust their wives and families with this esoteric knowledge. This would mean that the use of DMT and psychedelic drugs in general were not accidentally discovered, but instead taught by these beings who once roamed the earth with man prior to the biblical flood of Noah. Although it is purely just theory and speculation, I find it to be an interesting idea. The way that DMT is extracted is also similar to what is described as the dividing of roots and trees. One of the most natural concentrated sources of DMT comes from the root bark of the Mimosa hostilis tree.
This purple bark that surrounds the root is the part of the tree that has the most concentrated natural sources of DMT. Look at the depth of this color. It's really magnificent.
This plant is known as being a source for the extraction of DMT. It's fascinating that part of the process is literally ripping the root bark apart in order to get to where the DMT is most concentrated. Perhaps this is part of what the dividing of roots and trees in 1 Enoch refers to as well. The case for the dividing of roots and trees referring to DMT or ayahuasca becomes even more interesting when you stack all of this information with some claims made by Alex Jones. Although Alex Jones has been looked down upon by some, there is no denying that some of the claims he makes turn out to have some essence of truth to them. I am in no way claiming that anything he says is 100% accurate, but when researching information on the use of DMT and ayahuasca, I remembered some claims that he had made regarding the elite's use of psychedelic drugs. Let's take a look at some claims Jones has made.
They're not going to cover this.
The meat, okay.
Because this is not my opinion. This is the real research that I have heard, that I have talked to Army generals, commanding generals, major generals, generals, CIA, everybody. And they're all 100%. And I thought it was a psyop before, and then I've researched it. I've talked to hundreds of people now, not on air, who've taken ayahuasca and DMT, and it's unbelievable because, they 100% in San Francisco is the main project site, literally have an alien base, and they are literally communicating, and they've got like astronaut level people taking super hardcore levels of drugs and going into meetings with these things and making intergalactic deals. Again, that's what the government believes and says they're doing. And this isn't
when you say the government, that's a broad stroke. You're painting you're using a broad brush. Like, what do you mean by the government?
Breakaway rogue intelligence agencies.
Okay.
They've been doing this for 50 years. It's a mushroom cult. It's a hallucination cult. And they're in there in these DMT trances being told, and you're going to have tablets, and then they're going to interface, and then the kids will be addicted, and then we're going to jack into your brain. And they're being told while in an interdimensional trance at 6-dimensional level, connected in through your brain in that trance with demons telling them how to build this stuff, and then it's being done. That they believe while they take DMT and ayahuasca, these executives are just heavily into this stuff, that they're channeling the future. You have these spirit guides, like Mescalito and all this, little goat man. You know, you're taking DMT and a little goat man shows up. He's not your buddy, okay? Every culture starts taking hallucinogens and then starts worshiping entities that demand blood.
Perhaps it is possible that some people in high positions of power have discovered the ancient use of these so-called spirit drugs, and that they are using them to attain some form of secret or occult knowledge. Many of these claims made by Jones are just him referring to other people who have given him this information, and there is no way to tell whether this information is legitimate or not. Although Jones does not cite any evidence regarding the reality of these supposed interdimensional astronauts, we know that the government has spent much time delving into the world of psychedelics and their effect on human behavior through the CIA's infamous MKUltra experiments. If what Alex Jones is saying turns out to be true, could it be that the elites have determined this method of communicating with some type of demonic forces in exchange for earthly wisdom? I tend to have an open mind with these types of subjects and do not want to dismiss anything that might make sense. With all that said, how are we expected to view these various drugs in light of the possible origin that is presented in the Book of Enoch? I now want to take a look at what these drugs could mean about the current times that we are living in. I want to start by saying that the Bible repeatedly condemns the use of sorcery, incantations, and enchantments in both the Old and New Testaments. When Paul uses the word pharmakia, it is always in a way that condemns the use of it. The same can be said about the use of sorcery in the Old Testament, where witches and the use of magic was always considered to be evil in the sight of God. A lot of people might wonder why God condemns the use of the drug if it allows some people to occasionally have positive experiences. For example, many have claimed that these entities were able to teach them knowledge about themselves, or that they are typically happy or friendly beings when interacted with. I think it is worth noting that just because something feels good or seems good does not mean that it is actually good. One proverb comes to mind which says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death." I have mentioned before in my previous videos that Paul the Apostle writes about how Satan masquerades as an angel of light. This is interesting, as many DMT users report interacting with some type of angelic beings during their experiences. It is also worth noting the findings of Jennifer A. Like again, as she found that there are typically more hostile experiences than positive ones. She also mentions the seeming correlation of experiences that people have during UFO close encounters, near-death experiences, and DMT trips. Perhaps the reason for this is that they are all demonically influenced, similar to the claims I made regarding the UFO phenomenon in my previous videos. As seen in the Alex Jones clips, this is the view that he holds to as well. Some also might make the argument that because these drugs are produced naturally in the human brain, then why should we not allow ourselves to indulge in them? The way that I view it is that these drugs seem to make people's minds vulnerable to some type of external world or reality that is separate from the material world. It's almost as if our brains are the antenna receiving a signal, and these drugs allow some type of message to be sent to them. In light of that, I think there is a reason that God prohibits the use of these drugs, as they could result in deception or some type of permanent impact on the mind. Based on what the Bible says, these drugs could very well allow for humans to have some type of interaction with demonic entities that may sometimes present themselves as being friendly or welcoming. With that said, I don't want to discount or discredit the positive experiences that some claim to have during the use of these drugs, as they obviously seem to have a profound impact on the user. I just want to make people aware of God's view of these types of drugs and how he commands his followers to avoid them at all costs. I truly believe that if someone claims to be a Christian, then they need to avoid the use of these drugs completely. I also think there is a reason that there is a sort of resurgence that we are seeing of these types of drugs in the modern day. In the Bible, when the word pharmakia is used in the Book of Revelation, it is referring to the destruction of Babylon near the end of the age. Let's take a closer look at what one verse says about pharmakia. Revelation 18:23 reads, "And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery." The word sorcery used in the verse comes from the word pharmakia. We also see in Isaiah 47 that one of the major characteristics to describe Babylon in the last days will be the use of enchantments and sorcery. Isaiah 47:12 reads, "Keep on then with your magic spells, and with your many sorceries which you have labored at since childhood." Again, there seems to be some type of connection between the use of sorcery or pharmakia to Mystery Babylon spoken of in the New Testament. If in fact there will be a return of pharmakia in the last days, it could be referring to some type of psychedelic drug use, perhaps even DMT, that will be used to deceive the nations. This connects well with some words spoken of by Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus says in Matthew 24:37, "For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man." Many have used this verse to connect what information we know about the world before the flood to the end of the age. As mentioned before, if the use of DMT, ayahuasca, and psychedelic drugs were introduced prior to the flood, or in the days of Noah, then perhaps this is one aspect that is beginning to resurface that is in effect fulfilling what Jesus said about the final age before his return to Earth. This is nothing more than speculation and theory, but it seems that there could be some correlation to the words of Jesus, Babylon, the days of Noah, and the dividing of roots and trees. Perhaps the key to connecting all of these events is actually the resurgence of the use of psychedelic drugs. Perhaps even specifically the drug DMT or dimethyltryptamine, which has now earned the nickname the spirit molecule.